had been driving for hours. The old highway stretched endlessly, cutting through thick forests and empty fields. The road was slick with rain, and my windshield wipers struggled to keep up. I was on my way to a cabin that my uncle had left behind when he passed away. It had been sitting empty for years, deep in the woods, far from any town. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but I figured I could fix it up. Maybe sell it, or just use it as a quiet getaway. I had taken the back roads, wanting to avoid traffic, but now I was regretting it. The fuel gauge was getting low, and I hadn't seen a gas station in over an hour. The GPS had lost signal miles ago, and I was relying on an old paper map I had printed before leaving. The rain made it hard to see the road, and the trees pressed in on either side, their wet branches hanging low, almost brushing against my truck. When I finally saw the turnoff for the cabin, I almost missed it. A narrow dirt path, barely visible, led off into the trees. I slowed down, turning onto the road, my tires sinking slightly into the muddy ground. The forest swallowed me whole. The deeper I drove, the darker it got. The thick canopy overhead blocked out most of the light, and the rain made everything feel heavier, pressing down on me. The cabin appeared out of nowhere, sitting in a small clearing. It was exactly how I remembered it. Small, made of old dark wood, with a sagging porch and a rusted metal roof. The windows were dirty, the glass streaked from years of neglect. I parked the truck and stepped out. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. I grabbed my bag and walked up the steps. The porch creaked under my weight. When I reached for the door, I saw the lock was broken. That wasn't right. I had expected the place to be run down, but I didn't think anyone had been here in years. I pushed the door open, my other hand gripping the knife I always carried in my jacket pocket. Inside, the cabin was just how I remembered it. The small living area had a stone fireplace, a couch covered in an old sheet, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. The kitchen was barely more than a counter with a sink, a rusted-out stove, and a few cabinets. The bedroom was in the back, with a narrow bed against the wall. Everything smelled of dust, damp wood, and something else, something faint but sour. I set my bag down and checked the place over. The lock on the front door was broken, but nothing seemed disturbed. The furniture was still covered in dust, and there were no signs that anyone had been inside. I shook off the uneasy feeling and decided to get a fire going. I went outside to grab some wood from the old pile next to the cabin. The rain had let up slightly, turning into a light drizzle. I stacked the logs inside and lit a fire in the fireplace, watching as the flames slowly came to life. The warmth helped chase away the damp cold, but the unease in my gut didn't go away. As I moved through the cabin, checking the windows and making sure nothing was leaking, I noticed something odd. In the bedroom, on the floor near the bed, were footprints. Muddy footprints. They weren't mine. I froze, staring at them. They led from the window to the bed, then stopped. No prints leading away, just those few, as if someone had stood there, watching the bed, and then disappeared. I looked at the window. It was closed, but the lock was broken, just like the front door. My stomach twisted. Someone had been in here, maybe recently. I checked the closet, under the bed, behind the old curtains, nothing. The cabin was empty, but those footprints didn't make sense. I tried to shake it off. Maybe they were old. Maybe someone had squatted here years ago. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The rain outside had been falling all day. Those prints were fresh. Night fell fast. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and I sat on the couch, eating a cold can of beans. My truck was parked just outside, and I told myself if anything felt wrong, I could leave. But something about the cabin felt off. The sounds of the woods at night were familiar. Crickets, the wind moving through the trees, the occasional rustle of an animal. But every now and then, I'd hear something else. A creak like weight shifting on wood. A faint scuffing sound came from the back of the cabin, near the bedroom. I didn't move. I just sat there, listening. The noise came again. Slow, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight, trying not to be heard. I stood up, my pulse pounding. The knife was still in my pocket, and I pulled it out as I moved toward the bedroom. The The firelight barely reached that far, leaving the hallway in shadows. I stepped inside. The footprints were still there, but now there were more. They hadn't been there earlier. I turned fast, scanning the room, my breath tight in my chest. Nothing. Just the room, the old bed, the dusty floor. Then I saw the closet door. It was slightly open. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. I yanked it open in one quick motion, knife raised. Nothing. Just darkness. The closet was empty, filled with old clothes and dust. But as I stood there, I heard it. A single creak coming from the living room. I turned and rushed back out, my knife tight in my grip. The front door was open, wide open. The rain poured outside, washing away the footprints on the porch. My truck was still there, but the sight of that open door made my stomach drop. I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring out into the dark woods beyond the clearing. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them, watching. I grabbed my keys off the table, shoved my bag over my shoulder, and walked straight to the truck. I didn't run. I didn't look around. I just got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the rain, lighting up the trees ahead. Nothing moved. I pressed down on the gas and pulled out, my tires slipping slightly in the mud. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw movement on the porch. A figure standing just inside the cabin, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back again. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel and sat awake until dawn, knife in my lap, every sound making my skin crawl. The next day, I called someone to board up the cabin. I never went back, and I never found out who had been in there with me that night. I was never afraid of being alone in the woods. Some people hated the silence, the isolation, the way the trees seemed to swallow up the world. But for me, it was peace. It was freedom. That was why I had spent every hunting season deep in the forests of northern Montana, in the same old cabin my father had used when I was a kid. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-room structure, a wood-burning stove, and a small porch that faced the valley below. It had a well out back, an outhouse about 20 yards away, and a shed where I kept some extra supplies. No electricity, no running water, no neighbors for miles. Just the forest, the mountains, and whatever I could carry in with me. This year, I had come out early in November, planning to stay a week. I wanted to bag a deer before the first real snowfall. The roads leading in were already rough, but I managed to get my truck as far as the base of the ridge. From there, I hiked the last 2 miles with my gear. It was cold, but not unbearable. I had done it a dozen times before. I spent the first 2 days scouting the area, following deer tracks along the valley, setting up a few game cameras. Felt good to be back. At night, I would sit on the porch, sip from a flask, and listen to the wind push through the trees. But on the 3rd day, I noticed something strange. I had woken up before dawn, planning to hike up the ridge where I had seen fresh tracks the day before. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was the ground. Footprints. Human footprints. They were faint, but clear enough in the frost-covered dirt. They led from the tree line toward my cabin, stopping about 10 feet from the porch before turning around and vanishing back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them. The thing that unsettled me the most wasn't that someone had come near my cabin. It was the way the prints stopped. No hesitation, no circling the cabin, just a straight path to the edge of the clearing and back out. Like whoever it was had walked right up, stood there for a minute, then left. I told myself it was just a hunter, someone passing through, maybe checking to see if the cabin was occupied. But still, it stuck with me the whole day. That evening, as I sat on the porch cleaning my rifle, I kept glancing at the tree line. The sun had dipped below the ridge, and the temperature was dropping fast. The forest had that heavy stillness that only comes in deep winter. Then I heard it, a single crack somewhere up the slope, like a branch snapping underfoot. I tensed, holding my breath, listening. Another crack, then nothing, just silence. I stood up, rifle in hand, scanning the trees. It was getting too dark to see much, but I swore I saw movement, a slow, deliberate shift of shadow between the trunks. I stayed out there for nearly an hour, watching, listening, but nothing else happened. No more sounds, no more movement. That night, I locked the cabin door. The next morning, I checked the clearing again. More footprints. This time, they came even closer, almost to the porch. I stared at them, heart hammering. They were fresh. Sometime during the night, someone had walked right up to my cabin. I followed them as far as I could before they disappeared into the undergrowth. No sign of a campsite, no sign of fire, discarded gear, nothing. I thought about packing up, leaving early, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I had a rifle, plenty of ammo, and enough experience in the woods to handle myself. If someone was creeping around, I'd find out who. That day, I barely left the cabin. I stayed close, checking my game cameras, walking the perimeter, trying to see if there were any more tracks leading in a different direction. Just before dusk, I took my rifle and hiked up the ridge, hoping to spot something from higher ground. The valley stretched out below, dark and empty. Nothing moved. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. Near the tree line, almost at the very edge of the clearing around my cabin, movement. A figure. I dropped into a crouch, raising my scope. It was a man, standing just inside the trees, half hidden by the branches. He wasn't wearing hunting gear, just dark clothes, maybe a jacket. No rifle, no backpack. He was just standing there, watching my cabin. A chill went through me. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just watched him. Then, as if he knew I was looking, he turned and walked back into the woods. Not in a hurry, just slow, casual steps until he disappeared into the trees. I stayed up on that ridge until the last bit of light was gone. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door and bolted it shut. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, rifle across my lap, listening. Sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I held my breath, my finger resting on the trigger. My truck was miles away. If something happened, I was on my own. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly fired right then, but I forced myself to wait. Whoever it was, they didn't try to break in. They just tested the door. Then silence. I sat there for hours, waiting for morning. When the first light crept through the trees, I opened the door. The footprints were there, right up against the cabin. But this time, there was something else. A single knife, stabbed into the wood of my porch railing. No note, no message, just the knife. I didn't pack. I didn't waste time. I grabbed what I could and started the hike back to my truck. When I got there, I checked the tires, the engine, nothing had been touched. But as I climbed in and slammed the door shut, I saw something in the rearview mirror. Up on the ridge, half hidden in the trees, was a figure. Watching. I drove out of there and never went back. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. They weren't just passing through. They were waiting for what I never wanted to find out. I never wanted to take the job. It was late October when I got the call from a friend of a friend. A groundskeeper for an old cemetery on the outskirts of town had quit suddenly. The cemetery belonged to a small, nearly forgotten church, and with winter coming, they needed someone to stay on site and keep an eye on things. Mostly to stop people from breaking in or messing around. It wasn't the kind of job anyone wanted, but I needed the money. It was temporary, only a few weeks until they found someone permanent. The pay wasn't bad, and they offered a place to stay. That was the part that made me hesitate. The place to stay was a small wooden cabin sitting just beyond the rows of headstones, barely on the edge of the property. The thought of living right next to a cemetery for weeks wasn't something I liked, but I figured I'd be inside most of the time. I could deal with it. When I arrived, the place looked even worse than I expected. The cemetery was old, the kind of place that didn't get visitors anymore. Some of the headstones were tilting, the names worn away by decades of rain and wind. The church that owned it was a mile down the road, and no one was around. It felt isolated, cut off. The dirt road leading in was cracked and uneven, as if no one had driven down it in years. The cabin was even worse. It sat near the tree line, about 50 yards from the first row of graves. It wasn't big, just a one-room structure with a bed, a small kitchen area, and an old oil heater that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. There was no electricity, just a generator outside that ran on diesel. The last guy had left behind a few half-empty gas cans. I had brought my own just in case. I unloaded my things and tried to settle in. The place smelled damp, like old wood and mildew. The windows had no curtains, just open glass staring out toward the cemetery. I had an old battery-powered lantern, which I kept close as the sun started to go down. The heater barely worked, but I had enough blankets to get through the night. First, it wasn't bad. It was cold, quiet, too quiet. I wasn't used to the kind of silence that settled in after dark. No distant traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional sound of wind through the trees. The graves sat there in the moonlight, pale stone markers stretching out in uneven rows. The first couple of nights, I barely slept. Every little sound made me sit up and listen. The wind in the trees, the creaking of the wooden cabin walls as they shifted in the cold. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling never really went away. Then things got worse. The first real sign that something was off happened on the fourth night. I had been walking the perimeter of the cemetery, checking for any signs of trespassers. The job wasn't just about keeping people out, it was about making sure no animals got in, that nothing was disturbed. I had a flashlight with me, the kind with a long beam, and as I swept it across the gravestones, something caught my eye. A single headstone off near the tree line had been pushed over. It wasn't cracked or broken, just lying flat on the ground, as if someone had knocked it over. It hadn't been like that the day before. I walked over, shining my light around, looking for footprints or anything else that might explain it. Nothing. The dirt around it was undisturbed, as if it had just fallen over on its own. I tried to set it back up, but the thing was heavy, too heavy for me to lift alone. I made a note to tell the church about it in the morning and went back inside the cabin. That night, I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. Not the wind, not the creaking of the cabin. Something outside. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking through the cemetery, pausing, then moving again. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, just before dawn, I heard something else. A scraping sound, right outside the cabin wall. I shot up, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. I flicked it on and aimed it at the window. Nothing, just the cemetery, still and quiet under the early morning sky. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it again, closer. I forced myself to get up, to go to the door. My hand hesitated on the handle, but I yanked it open and shined my light outside. Nothing, but there, in the dirt just a few feet from my cabin, were fresh marks. Scratches in the ground, like someone had dragged something heavy through the dirt. The marks led toward the cemetery. I didn't follow them. By the time the sun came up, the marks were gone. The wind had wiped them away. I spent the morning checking the graves, but everything looked normal, except for the headstone that had been knocked over. It was back in place. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The nights got worse. Every evening, just after dark, I'd start to hear things. Sometimes it was footsteps in the cemetery. Sometimes it was the sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. The worst part was that it never seemed random. Whatever it was, it moved with purpose. One night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was coming from outside, just beneath my window. Slow, steady. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to even turn my head. The breathing went on for what felt like hours, then just stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The last night I spent in that cabin was the worst. I had been running the generator less and less, trying to save fuel. That meant longer hours in the dark, just me and my flashlight. That night, the wind was bad. It howled through the trees, making the whole cabin shudder. I lay in bed, waiting for sleep that never came. Then, just past midnight, I heard the door handle rattle. Slow at first, then harder. I bolted upright, heart slamming against my ribs. The lock held, but something was trying to get in. I reached for my flashlight, hand shaking, and aimed it at the door. The rattling stopped. Then, a single knock, soft, almost polite. I didn't move. Another knock, then silence. I sat there for what felt like forever, barely breathing. The wind outside had stopped. The whole world felt like it was holding its breath. Then, scratching. Long, slow scratches along the wooden door. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, and my keys, and I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. The engine roared to life, and I tore down that dirt road, not looking back. I never went back. I called the church the next day and told them I quit. They didn't argue. I didn't ask if they had found anyone else. I didn't care. A few months later, I heard the cemetery was abandoned. No one took the job after me. The church eventually shut down. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that slow, steady scratching at my door. It was 2016, and I was 32 when I took the job. It wasn't a dream opportunity, just something to keep me going after I'd left my previous work on bad terms. My boss, an older man named Richard, owned a series of hunting cabins scattered throughout the Scottish Highlands. He rented them out to hunters and tourists, but most of them were in rough condition, falling apart from years of neglect. My job was to live in one of these cabins for a few weeks, fixing it up enough so it could be rented again. The location was remote, far more than I expected. I took a train up from Manchester, then had to rent a truck just to drive the last stretch of the journey. There were no main roads leading up to the property, just dirt tracks cutting through endless miles of wilderness. It felt empty, unsettling in a way I couldn't put into words. When I arrived, I could see why the cabin needed repairs. The wood was weathered and cracked, the roof sagged in places, and the front door barely hung on its hinges. Inside, it was musty with old furniture covered in dust. There were 2 rooms, a small bedroom with a rickety bed and a main living area with a stone fireplace, a table, and a couple of chairs. No electricity, no running water, just a gas stove and a backup generator that barely worked. I unloaded my supplies, food, tools, and a rifle that Richard had left for me, just in case. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I assumed it was for animals. There were stories about wild boars in the area, and I wasn't about to take chances. The first few days were uneventful. I worked during daylight, replacing broken planks, clearing out debris, and sealing gaps in the walls. The nights, though, were unnerving. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind through the trees or the occasional sound of something moving outside. I told myself it was just wildlife, but every so often, I'd hear something strange, like footsteps. Not heavy, not obvious, just a soft crunching sound in the underbrush that always stopped the moment I paid attention. On the 5th night, I woke to a sound I couldn't ignore. It was past midnight, and I had been in a restless sleep when something outside snapped me awake. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, a deliberate creak of wood, like weight shifting on the porch. I sat up, listening. The rifle was by my bed, and I reached for it instinctively. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? A boar? Maybe even a person? There weren't any nearby houses or roads, and I hadn't seen another human since I arrived. The idea that someone might be outside unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Minutes passed. The creaking stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, too wired to sleep. When daylight finally came, I forced myself outside. The air was crisp, cold despite it being early autumn. I checked around the cabin, expecting to see animal tracks, But what I found made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints circling the cabin. The ground was damp from rain the night before, so the prints were fresh, recent enough that they hadn't been disturbed. Someone had walked around the cabin in the night, stopping just outside my door. I followed the tracks a few meters before they disappeared into the woods. I had two options: pack up and leave, or stay and pretend it didn't happen. The logical thing was to go, but I had spent too much money and time getting here. Besides, I convinced myself that maybe it was just a lost hiker. The highlands were vast, and people sometimes wandered too far from trails. I stayed. The next few days, I was more cautious. I kept the rifle loaded and near me at all times. I set up makeshift alarms, strings with empty cans hanging from the porch. If someone tried sneaking up, I'd hear them. For a while, nothing happened. Then, on the 10th night, I woke up again. This time, it was different. I smelled something, a strong, foul odor, like rotting meat, wafted through the cabin. It was so pungent, it made my eyes water. I sat up, heart pounding. The smell wasn't there when I'd gone to sleep, and it wasn't coming from inside. I hesitated, then grabbed the rifle and my flashlight. My hands felt clammy as I stepped onto the porch. The air was thick with the stench, and the moment I turned the light towards the trees, I saw it. Carcass, a deer, gutted and strung up by its hind legs from a low tree branch. Its belly had been sliced open, entrails spilling onto the ground in a wet heap. The blood was still fresh, glistening in the flashlight's beam. But that wasn't the worst part. Someone had carved something into its side, a message crudely etched into the flesh. Leave. My body locked up. The wind stirred the trees, and for a second, I swore I heard breathing nearby. Slow, deliberate. I turned off the flashlight, stood there, frozen, rifle gripped so tightly my fingers ached. I wanted to run back inside, but I knew if someone was out there, they could be watching me, waiting. I backed up slowly, step by step, until I reached the door, slipped inside, locked it. The rest of the night was a blur. I sat in the dark, listening, waiting. The smell of the carcass lingered, but nothing else happened. Morning came and I made my decision. I was leaving. No job was worth this. I packed my things in under an hour. I didn't bother checking outside until I was ready to go. When I finally did, the deer carcass was gone. Only a dark stain remained on the ground. The footprints were back too. More of them this time. They led from the trees to the cabin and then away again, as if whoever had been watching me wanted me to know they were close, that they could have come inside if they wanted to. I didn't waste another second. I got in the truck, started the engine, and didn't look back. I drove until I hit the main road, then kept going, straight to the nearest town. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just found a motel, locked the door, and tried to forget. Weeks later, Richard called, wondering why I'd left without notice. I lied and told him I had an emergency. He didn't seem too bothered, just asked if I'd at least managed to get some of the work done. I never told him the real reason I left. Never told anyone. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints, about the deer carcass and the message carved into its side. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. It had been almost 2 years since my wife passed away. 2 years of trying to keep myself busy, drowning in work, and avoiding the places that held memories too painful to face. The cabin was one of those places. We had bought it together 10 years ago, deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was meant to be our getaway, a quiet escape from the city where we could fish in the lake, sit by the fire, and just be away from everything. But after she died, I stopped going. I couldn't even drive past the road that led to it. Until last week. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe I was tired of running from it. Maybe I thought I was finally strong enough. Or maybe, deep down, I just needed to see if the place still existed without her in it. So I packed a bag, threw it in the back of my truck, and drove north. The roads were familiar but different. The small towns along the way looked a little more run down than I remembered, and the gas stations were even emptier than before. It felt like I was driving into a past that no longer existed. By the time I turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. The trees on either side of the road were tall and dark, their bare branches stretching overhead like a tunnel. The cabin sat at the end of the road, just past a clearing. It looked the same. The wooden porch, the slanted roof, the chimney that hadn't seen smoke in years. The driveway was covered in leaves, untouched by tire tracks. I parked and sat in the truck for a while, staring at it, feeling that deep, heavy weight settle in my chest. Eventually, I forced myself to get out. The air was cold, sharper than I expected for early October. I grabbed my bag from the truck bed and walked up the steps. The porch creaked under my weight. The front door was locked, just the way I had left it. I fumbled with the keys, my hands stiff from the cold, and finally got the door open. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. The last time I had been here, she was still alive. Everything was as we left it. The blankets were still folded over the couch. Her books were still stacked on the side table. Even the old coffee mug she used to drink from was sitting in the sink. I had told myself I wouldn't get emotional, but I did. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. I had planned to clean up a little, maybe air the place out, but instead, I just sat on the couch, staring at nothing. As the hours passed, the cabin grew darker. I lit the old oil lamp on the table and turned on the propane heater. The night outside was completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just dead, heavy quiet. Then something shifted. It wasn't a noise exactly, more like a feeling, that eerie sensation that someone is watching you. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The cabin had always felt different at night, even when she was here. I got up and checked the windows. Nothing, just the black outline of trees against the night sky. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. The bed felt wrong without her in it. So I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Then I heard something, a soft crunching sound outside, like footsteps on dried leaves. I held my breath. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, a coyote. They wandered through these woods all the time. But then it came again, closer this time. I sat up, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The porch creaked. I wasn't alone. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, clicking it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, shaking slightly in my unsteady grip. Another creak. Someone was standing on the porch. I moved slowly, stepping out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The wooden floor was cold under my feet. I grabbed the rifle from the corner of the room, the one I always kept at the cabin for hunting. I made my way toward the front window, crouching low. The porch light was off, but the moon cast just enough light for me to see a dark shape standing by the door. Not an animal, a man. I couldn't make out his face, just the outline of his body, tall and still. He wasn't moving, just standing there, listening. I gripped the rifle tighter, my mind racing. I had left my truck parked out front. He knew someone was here. Another creak. This time, it came from the side of the cabin. There were two of them. A second shadow moved along the wall, just past the window. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. I had to be smart. I had to get out of there. I moved back toward the bedroom, keeping low, trying to stay in the shadows. My truck keys were in my bag by the couch. If I could get to them, I could make a run for it. Another creak. The doorknob rattled. They were trying to get in. I grabbed my bag, pulling the zipper as quietly as I could. The keys jingled softly, too loud. A louder noise came from the back of the cabin. A sharp, splintering crack. They were breaking in. I had no choice. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and raising the rifle. The man on the porch was closer now, his face just a blur of shadow and pale skin. I didn't wait. I fired. The gunshot shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. The man didn't scream. He just stumbled back, vanishing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see where he went. I ran. I sprinted to my truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life. In the rearview mirror, I saw movement, dark shapes slipping between the trees. I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the dirt road. I didn't stop. Not until I hit the highway, not until the cabin was miles behind me. I never went back. I don't know who they were. I don't want to know. The cabin still stands, I assume. Abandoned now, lost in the woods, just a place I used to know. A place that once held love, then grief, and now something else. I haven't told anyone about that night. I don't think I ever will. It had been raining for 3 days straight. Not the kind of light drizzle that makes the air feel fresh, but a constant, heavy downpour that soaked through my clothes no matter how many layers I wore. The wind didn't help either. It pushed the rain sideways, made the trees groan, and carried a bitter chill that got into my bones. I was out in the middle of nowhere, working on a half-finished cabin that belonged to a man I barely knew. My boss had taken the job, a full cabin build in a remote part of the woods, and since I was the youngest guy on the crew, I was the one sent out for the night shift. Just do some finishing work, my boss had said. Secure the beams, check the roofing, tighten up anything loose. Easy stuff, according to him. But standing there, in the cold rain, the wind howling through the trees, it didn't feel easy. The cabin was just a frame at this point. Wooden beams forming the skeleton, half a roof overhead, and only a few walls up. It wasn't much shelter from the rain. My truck was parked about 50 feet away, on a strip of dirt that was quickly turning to mud. The headlights were on, shining through the rain like two dull eyes, barely helping. I had a portable work light set up near the structure, but the wind made the shadows shift constantly, like something was moving just beyond my sight. I didn't like this place. It wasn't fear, not exactly. Just that uncomfortable feeling you get when something is off. Too quiet, too dark, too empty. The rain should have made noise as it hit the ground. The wood, the leaves, but it all felt muffled, like the forest was swallowing the sound. I grabbed my tool belt and got to work, starting with the roof beams. The wind made them creak above me, and I kept glancing up, half expecting one to snap loose. The last thing I needed was to get crushed by a falling log in the middle of nowhere. The hours dragged. The cold got worse. My fingers felt stiff, even in gloves. Every now and then I stopped to listen. Not because I wanted to, because I felt like I had to. It was that deep, gnawing sense that I wasn't alone out there. A branch cracked somewhere behind me. I turned fast, heart thudding, but saw nothing. Just trees, rain, and darkness. My truck's headlights barely reached the edge of the clearing, and beyond that, it was black. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. Could have been anything. But I still felt that heavy, crawling sensation on my skin, like I was being watched. I forced myself to keep working. A while later, I moved to the side of the cabin where I had stacked some lumber earlier. The ground was a mess. Mud, wet leaves, pools of water. I reached down, grabbed a plank, and then I saw it. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, deep in the mud, leading from the trees toward the cabin. I froze. My breath came sharp and fast. The prints were large, heavier than mine, and spaced like someone had been moving slow. Watching, I looked around, my mind racing. The rain had covered most of the sounds, but I was sure I hadn't heard anyone approach. And there was no reason for someone else to be out here. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and pointed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were wet trunks and tangled branches. Nothing moved. I waited, staring into the woods, every muscle tight. The rain dripped from the trees. The wind sighed. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, something shifted. A figure. I barely saw it. Just the slightest movement. A dark shape blending into the trees. No details, no face, just the sense that someone was standing there. Watching me, I stood frozen, gripping the flashlight so tight my fingers ached. I couldn't see them clearly, but I knew they were there. Slowly, I reached down, picked up the hammer from my belt and stepped back toward the cabin. The work light flickered as the wind shook it, casting wild shadows across the half-built walls. I turned, scanning the trees again, but the figure was gone. I felt trapped. The truck was 50 feet away, across open ground. The trees surrounded me on all sides. If I ran, would they chase me? If I stayed, would they come closer? I took another step back. The mud sucked at my boots. My breathing felt too loud. Then I heard it. Not a voice, not words, just a low, slow breath. In. Close. Too close. I spun, shining the flashlight wildly, expecting to see someone right behind me. Nothing. The footprints were still there. The trees still swayed. The wind still howled. But I wasn't alone. I turned and walked, fast and steady, toward my truck. I kept my eyes ahead, but I could feel something at my back. Not chasing, not running, just following. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, and jumped in, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the keys. The headlights cut across the clearing as I turned the engine over. For a second, everything looked normal. Just a work site in the rain, piles of lumber, tools scattered where I'd left them. And then, just at the edge of the light, half hidden by the trees, I saw him. A man, tall, still, watching. I didn't think. I just hit the gas. Mud sprayed as the tires fought for grip. Then I was moving, headlights bouncing, trees blurring past. I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away. Back on the main road, heart still hammering, rain still pounding against the windshield. I never told my boss what I saw. Just made an excuse, said the storm was too rough to work in. A few weeks later, someone else finished the cabin. I never went back. And sometimes, when it's raining, I think about those footprints in the mud, about the figure standing in the trees, about the breath too close in the dark. And I wonder how long he'd been watching me before I noticed. I needed a break. Work had been relentless for the past few months, and I felt drained, like I was running on fumes. I wanted to go somewhere quiet, far from the noise of the city, somewhere I could be alone with my thoughts. That's how I ended up in France, renting a small cabin in the woods. It wasn't a fancy vacation spot, just a simple place in the countryside, far enough from any major town that I wouldn't have to deal with crowds or distractions. That was the whole point. The cabin belonged to an older man named Jacques, who lived in a farmhouse a few miles down the road. He rented it out to people looking for solitude, hunters, or the occasional traveler who didn't mind roughing it. It wasn't a luxurious place by any means, just a single-story wooden structure with basic furniture, a wood stove, and no electricity. I had to use gas lamps at night and rely on a small generator if I wanted power. But I didn't mind. That was exactly what I was looking for. The first few days were peaceful. The air was crisp, the forest stretched out in all directions, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I spent most of my time reading, hiking, and chopping firewood to keep the cabin warm at night. It was perfect. But then, on the fourth night, something changed. I had finished eating a simple meal and was sitting on the porch, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. The sky was dark, the stars bright, and the forest was silent except for the occasional chirp of insects. That's when I saw him. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. He was standing just beyond the tree line, maybe 50 meters away, barely visible in the dim light. A tall figure, motionless, just standing there, watching. I stared for a long time, expecting him to move, to reveal himself as just another traveler or a local hunter passing through. But he didn't. He just stood there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe a farmer from a nearby village, maybe even Jacques checking in on the cabin. But something felt wrong. The way he stood there, perfectly still, facing me without making a sound, it made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the tree line. The moment the beam landed on him, he stepped back, vanishing into the trees like a shadow. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of him disappearing into the darkness. A strange feeling settled over me. My instincts told me to lock the door and stay inside. It wasn't that I was afraid of one man, but the way he had just stood there, silently watching me, didn't sit right. I went inside, locked the door, and sat in the chair by the window. I kept the flashlight in my hand, listening. But the forest was silent again, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I had been staring too long at the darkness and convinced myself there was someone there. But I couldn't shake the unease. I walked to the spot where I had seen him. The ground was covered in leaves, twigs, and patches of damp earth. I looked for footprints, but the forest floor was too uneven to tell if anyone had been there. Still, I felt watched. That night, I kept my lantern on longer than usual. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees outside, making every shadow stretch and twist. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but then around midnight I heard it. Footsteps, not the light, quick steps of an animal. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the woods. I turned off the lantern, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the cabin. I barely breathed, then silence. Whoever it was, they were standing outside. I moved as quietly as I could to the window and peeked through the gap in the curtain. In the moonlight, I saw him again, standing just a few meters from my porch. Closer this time. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. A shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to shout, to scare him off, but something about the way he stood there, unmoving, made my throat dry up. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back into the woods. No rush, no panic, just walked away, disappearing into the trees like before. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went to Jacques' farmhouse. I told him what had happened, expecting him to dismiss it, but his expression darkened. He was silent for a long time, then finally muttered something about staying inside at night and keeping my doors locked. That wasn't comforting. I thought about leaving, but I had paid for another week, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. I convinced myself it was just a local messing around, maybe some guy trying to scare me for fun. That night, I locked everything. I kept my lantern burning, but every noise outside made my skin crawl. I didn't see him again that night, but I barely slept. The next day, I went into the woods. Not far, just to see if there were any signs of him. That's when I found the cabin. It was deep in the trees, hidden between thick branches and undergrowth. An old, rotting structure barely standing. The door was missing, and the inside was empty except for an old mattress and piles of leaves where animals had nested. But someone had been there recently. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, a pile of ashes from an old fire. Then I saw something that made my stomach twist. A set of clothes folded neatly on the mattress. A shirt, pants, a jacket, all covered in dried mud. The same clothes the man had been wearing. I left immediately. That night, I sat in the cabin, gripping my flashlight, waiting. I knew he was still out there, watching. I didn't sleep. I waited until sunrise, packed my things, and left. I never saw him again. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, standing somewhere in those woods, watching the empty cabin, waiting for the next person to come looking for solitude. Waiting. I hadn't been back to my grandmother's cabin in years. It wasn't out of neglect or lack of care. It was just life. You grow up, move away, get busy with work, relationships, and everything else. You always tell yourself you'll visit soon, but soon turns into years. When she passed away, it hit me harder than I expected. I always thought she'd be around forever, sitting in that old rocking chair on the porch, watching the trees sway in the wind. Her cabin was left to me in her will. I don't think she ever expected me to live in it, but maybe she hoped I'd take care of it. First, I thought about selling it. It was old, isolated, and needed work, but something in me couldn't let it go. Maybe it was guilt, maybe nostalgia. I don't know. So one weekend, I packed up my truck and made the long drive out there. It was deep in the woods, an hour away from the nearest town. The roads were rough, mostly dirt, and the deeper you went, the more overgrown they became. By the time I reached the driveway, it was clear no one had been there in a long time. The grass was wild, the wooden porch covered in leaves and dirt, and the roof had dark stains from years of rain. The cabin itself wasn't huge, just a single-story structure with a small attic, but it always had a cozy feeling when I was a kid. Now, though, it just looked abandoned. I unlocked the front door, and the smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. Everything was just as she left it. The kitchen table, her favorite chair, the blankets folded on the couch. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning, wiping away dust, sweeping out the dirt. It felt strange, almost like I was disturbing something. The cabin had a way of making you feel watched, even though I knew that was just my mind playing tricks on me. I told myself it was just the silence, the way the trees outside blocked out so much light. After getting things in order, I decided to take a walk around the property. My grandmother had owned a good chunk of land, mostly thick woods. As a kid, I loved exploring out there, finding old deer trails, climbing trees, skipping rocks in the creek a mile back. But as I walked, something felt off. First, it was just little things. A broken tree limb hanging lower than it should, the absence of animal sounds, a faint smell of something rotten in the air. I figured maybe a deer had died nearby. That wasn't uncommon. But as I kept going, the feeling grew stronger, like I wasn't alone. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't old either. The dirt was fresh, slightly damp from the rain a few days ago. The prints were deep, heavier than mine, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. I crouched down, looking closer. The shape was strange. Not boots, not bare feet, just odd, wide, uneven. I felt my stomach tighten. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe an old pair of my grandpa's boots that had deformed over time. But I didn't believe it. The more I looked at them, the more I realized they weren't shaped like anything I'd seen before. I turned back, heading for the cabin, walking faster than I wanted to. The woods suddenly felt different, like the trees were leaning in closer, watching. I told myself I was just spooking myself. But when I got back to the cabin, my gut dropped. The front door was open. I knew I had closed it. I was sure of it. I stepped inside, slow, careful. Everything looked the same, but it felt different. The air was heavier. I checked each room, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Nothing was missing, but something had changed. The blanket on the couch was unfolded now. A chair was slightly pulled out from the kitchen table. I locked the door and sat down, trying to shake the unease. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe I left the door open without thinking. Maybe the wind moved the blanket. But deep down, I knew better. Night came fast. Out here, without streetlights or houses nearby, the darkness was absolute. I had an old lantern, but even that barely cut through the pitch black outside. The forest was silent. Too silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just stillness. Then I heard it. A soft crunch. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I sat up, my body frozen. Another crunch. Closer this time. I reached for the old hunting rifle my grandfather kept in the corner, my hands gripping the wood tightly. I didn't move. I just listened. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow, like whoever or whatever. It was wanted me to know it was there. Then they stopped, right outside the front door. I held my breath. Silence. Then the doorknob moved. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't aggressive. It was slow, testing, almost patient. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, but my hands were shaking. The knob turned just slightly, then stopped. The air was thick with tension. My own heartbeat the loudest thing in the room. Then, after what felt like an eternity, footsteps. Moving away this time, back into the woods. I sat there for hours, gripping the rifle, waiting for it to come back. But it never did. When morning came, I stepped outside. The grass was flattened where something had stood for a long time, watching. I didn't stay another night. I packed up, locked the place up tight, and left. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I haven't been back to my grandmother's cabin since. Maybe I never will. It had been raining for hours by the time I reached the cabin. The sky was a dark, unbroken sheet of gray, and the wind carried the smell of damp earth and wet pine. The gravel road leading up to the cabin had been nearly washed away by the rain, forcing me to take it slow. The tires of my truck skidded once on the slick mud, and for a brief moment, I thought I might not make it. I had rented the place for a weekend. It wasn't much. A small one-bedroom cabin tucked deep into the woods, miles from the nearest town. The listing had said it was an old hunting lodge, long abandoned before being fixed up by the owner. The pictures showed a cozy wooden structure, a stone fireplace, and a porch overlooking a clearing in the trees. It had seemed perfect when I booked it. Secluded, peaceful, away from everything. The rain hammered against the windshield as I pulled up in front of the cabin. The headlights illuminated the porch, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The place looked different than the pictures. Older. The wood was darker, more weathered. The windows were streaked with dirt and rain, making it hard to see inside. I turned off the engine and stepped out. My boots sank slightly into the mud, and cold water ran down the back of my neck as I grabbed my bag from the truck bed. The trees around the cabin swayed with the wind, their branches creaking like something alive. The sound of the rain hitting the roof was deafening. I climbed the porch steps, the wood groaning under my weight. The front door was heavier than I expected, and it took some effort to shove it open. Inside, the cabin was dark. The air smelled stale, like wood smoke and something faintly damp. I flicked the light switch, and a single overhead bulb buzzed to life, casting a weak, yellow glow. The inside was just as simple as the listing had shown. A small kitchenette, a couch against the far wall, a wooden table with 2 chairs. In the corner, a stone fireplace, cold and empty. A single door led to the bedroom, and beyond that, a tiny bathroom. I set my bag down near the couch and shrugged off my wet jacket. The rain drummed against the roof, louder now that I was inside. I checked my phone, no service. That wasn't surprising, but I had hoped I might get at least one bar. I moved to the window and looked out. The truck sat just where I had left it, headlights off, rain sliding down its body. Beyond it, the trees stretched into darkness, their outlines barely visible through the downpour. Something felt off. I told myself it was just the isolation, the rain, the way the wind made the trees look like they were moving, shifting. I was just tired from the drive, my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I locked the door. I spent the next hour settling in. The cabin had a small generator, but I didn't want to run it all night. I found some old candles in a drawer and lit one on the table. The flame flickered as a draft moved through the cabin. I ate a quick meal from the supplies I brought, a sandwich, some chips. The wind howled outside, and every so often, the rain slammed against the windows hard enough that I half expected the glass to break. I tried reading for a while, but I couldn't focus. The sound of the storm was too loud. The cabin felt too still. Every creak of the wood made my skin prickle. It was just an old cabin settling. That's what I told myself. I decided to turn in early. The bedroom was small, just a bed and a wooden dresser. I changed into dry clothes and climbed under the blankets, leaving the candle burning on the nightstand. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake. Something had woken me. I lay there listening. The rain had slowed to a steady patter. The wind had died down. Then I heard it, a sound just outside the cabin, a soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Could have been an animal, a deer, a raccoon, but it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were slow, purposeful. I reached for my phone out of instinct, but there was still no service. My heart pounded as I strained to hear. Silence. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the sound of the trees shifting. Then another step. Closer. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise. The candle cast flickering shadows across the wooden walls. My bag was still by the couch where I had left it. My keys were inside. If I needed to, I could make a run for the truck. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside the bedroom window. The window was covered by a thin curtain, barely enough to block out the light from the candle. I could see a shape beyond it, a dark outline. Someone was standing there. I barely breathed. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here? There were no other cabins nearby, no hiking trails, nothing. The figure didn't move. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. Then slowly the shape shifted. A shadow moved across the curtain as whoever it was stepped back. A few seconds passed. Then another sound. The front porch. The floorboards creaked under slow, deliberate weight. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could. My truck keys were still on the couch. I had to get to them. Then the doorknob rattled. I stopped, barely a few feet from the bedroom door. The sound was slow at first, then harder. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. I backed up, heart hammering. The only thing between me and whoever was on the other side was a flimsy wooden door. Then the rattling stopped. Silence. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then I heard it again. Not the doorknob this time. The sound of footsteps, moving away. I listened as they made their way down the porch steps, then onto the wet ground. I moved quickly, grabbing my keys and shoving my feet into my boots. I threw the front door open, the wind immediately whipping cold rain against my face. The porch was empty. The trees swayed in the darkness beyond the clearing. Whoever had been there was gone. I didn't wait. I ran for my truck, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered once, then roared to life. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the road ahead. I didn't see anyone, but as I pulled away, my tires slipping on the wet ground, I caught a glimpse of something in the side mirror. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I drove straight back to town. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I never found out who it was. I never went back to that cabin. The owner never mentioned anything strange when I canceled my stay early. Maybe they knew, maybe they didn't, but I do, and I'll never go back. I had never been the kind of person who believed in strange things. Superstition wasn't something I ever paid attention to, and I never wasted time thinking about myths or folklore. But some things, no matter how much we try to ignore them, demand to be acknowledged. Some things happen in ways that leave no room for doubt, no space for rational explanations. That was what I learned in the winter of 2018. I was in my early 30s back then, and I had taken a seasonal job maintaining a remote hunting cabin in the Yorkshire moors. It wasn't a fancy lodge, just a simple, sturdy structure used by a group of hunters during the season. The owner, a retired businessman, paid me well to keep an eye on it during the colder months, when the place sat empty. It wasn't a bad deal. The isolation suited me, and I didn't mind the cold. The job was straightforward. I made sure the roof didn't collapse under the weight of the snow, kept the pipes from freezing, and occasionally drove into town to restock supplies. I had a diesel generator for power, a wood stove for heat, and enough food to last me weeks at a time. The cabin sat at the edge of a large clearing, backed by thick, gnarled woods. It was a good half-hour's drive to the nearest village, and the only road leading to it was a narrow, twisting path that turned to deep mud whenever it rained. I had been there for about 6 weeks when things started happening. At first, they were small things, unusual but nothing that I couldn't brush off. One morning, I found strange tracks in the snow around the cabin. They weren't deer or fox prints. I knew what those looked like. These were long and thin, almost human, but with an unnatural length between each step. Whatever had made them had moved in a way that didn't make sense, like it had taken huge, unnatural strides. They circled the cabin once, then led back into the trees. I stood by the door, staring at them, trying to work out what could have made them. A trick of the snow, maybe? A distorted animal track? I didn't know, but I didn't like it. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound outside. It was a slow, deliberate dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the snow. I lay still, listening, my breath fogging in the cold air of the cabin. The sound moved around the building, stopping occasionally, before continuing again. I didn't move. Eventually, it faded into the distance, swallowed by the wind. The next morning, I went outside to check, but the snow had covered any tracks. I told myself it had been a tree branch, broken off by the wind, scraping against the ground as it was pushed along. I didn't believe that, not really, but it was easier to pretend I did. The following week, I went into town to restock supplies. The drive down was slow, the muddy road making it difficult to keep control of the truck. When I reached the village, I stopped by the small grocery store, picking up the essentials: canned food, firewood, fuel for the generator. The man at the counter, an older fellow with a lined face, glanced at me as he rang up my purchases. "Still up at the hunting cabin?" he asked. I nodded. "Best be careful out there," he said. "Strange things in those woods." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sky had darkened, and a thick fog had settled over the trees. The place felt different, heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. That night I heard it again, the dragging sound, but this time there was something else, a whispering just beyond the edge of hearing, low and rhythmic, like words spoken in a language I didn't understand. I didn't sleep. Days passed. The atmosphere around the cabin grew heavier, like a storm building just out of sight. I started noticing other things. Scratches on the wooden walls, too high to have been made by any animal I knew. A smell in the air, musky, rotten, like damp earth and decaying leaves. Then one evening I saw it. I had stepped outside to chop firewood, the axe in my hands, my breath clouding in the cold air. The sky was overcast, the last light of the day barely filtering through the thick clouds. Something moved at the tree line. First, I thought it was a deer, but then it stood up. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were long and thin, the proportions all wrong. The skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its head tilted to the side, watching me. I gripped the axe tighter. My heart pounded in my chest. The thing took a step forward, moving in that same unnatural way, covering too much ground in a single stride. I backed up toward the cabin, never taking my eyes off it. My hands were slick with sweat, despite the cold. Then it did something I still can't fully understand. It opened its mouth, wide, impossibly wide, and from it came a sound. A voice. My voice. It repeated something I had said earlier that day. A meaningless phrase, something I had muttered to myself while making coffee. But hearing it come from that thing's mouth in my own tone was wrong in a way I can't describe. I turned and ran inside, slamming the door shut. My hands fumbled with the lock as I pressed my back against the wood, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. For the rest of the night, I sat in the dark, the axe across my lap, listening. I could hear it moving outside, pacing, scratching, whispering. By dawn, it was gone. I didn't waste time. As soon as it was light enough to see, I packed my things, loaded the truck, and left. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I reached the village, I went straight to the store and told the old man I was leaving. He didn't look surprised. "Best not to stay too long in places like that," he said. I never went back. The owner of the cabin sent me an email a few weeks later, asking why I had abandoned the job. I didn't answer. I still think about it sometimes. About the thing in the woods. The way it moved. The way it spoke with my voice. I don't go into the wilderness anymore. I don't camp. I don't hike. Some things are better left alone. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me and my 2 kids, taking a break from everything. Work had been stressful. The kids were growing up too fast, and I just needed a few days to clear my head. So I booked a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was a place I had been to once, years ago, but back then I was much younger, and I never really paid attention to how isolated it was. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles away from any real town. The road leading up to it was long, twisting, and full of potholes. The further we drove, the less it looked like anyone had been out here in a long time. The trees were thick, towering over both sides of the road, blocking most of the daylight. It was the kind of place that felt like it belonged to nature more than to people. By the time we arrived, the sun was already starting to set. The cabin was just like I remembered, small but sturdy, with a single porch and an old wooden door. The logs that made up the walls looked darker than I recalled, aged by years of rain and wind. There was a small fire pit outside, a pile of split wood stacked nearby, and a creek that ran just behind the trees at the edge of the clearing. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner on the propane stove, we played a few card games by lantern light, and then we went to bed early. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms and a loft. My kids took the loft and I took the room downstairs. The beds were old, the kind that creaked if you moved too much, but we were tired enough that it didn't matter. It was around midnight when I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The room was quiet. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees outside. I sat up in bed, listening, waiting for something to explain why I had woken up. Then, from outside, I heard a crunching sound. Footsteps, not the light, quick steps of an animal. These were slow, heavy, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps moved around the side of the cabin, slow but steady. I glanced at the window, but the old curtains were thick, blocking my view. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat frozen, waiting to hear if it would stop. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps were gone. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, but I heard nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I went outside, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it had been an animal or just my tired brain playing tricks on me. But then I saw them. Footprints. Clear, deep footprints in the dirt just outside the cabin. I told myself they were mine, but as I looked closer, I knew they weren't. They were bigger, wider, and led in a slow, wandering path around the cabin. Whoever had been out here had walked the entire perimeter before disappearing into the trees. I didn't say anything to the kids. There was no reason to scare them. I forced myself to act normal, making breakfast, acting like everything was fine. But the whole time, I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting someone to step out of the woods. We spent most of the day fishing at the creek. The kids had fun, laughing, playing, completely unaware of how on edge I was. I kept my eyes on the trees, listening, watching, but nothing seemed out of place. That night, I made sure the door was locked, checked the windows twice, and kept my flashlight within reach. I told myself the footprints had probably been from an old hunter passing through, or maybe just a trick of the light. But deep down, I didn't believe that. At some point during the night, I woke up again. This time, I knew immediately what had disturbed me. The sound of the front doorknob turning. It wasn't loud, just a slow, steady rattling, like someone was testing it. I sat up, my entire body rigid, my ears straining. The doorknob rattled again. Then silence. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it at the door, but nothing happened. For a long time, I just sat there, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers ached. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, half expecting to see nothing. But the moment I looked at the ground, I felt my stomach tighten. More footprints. This time, they didn't just circle the cabin. They led straight up to the front door. I woke the kids, told them we were leaving early, and started packing up. I didn't tell them why, just that I had changed my mind. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, back at the cabin disappearing into the trees. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw someone, standing just at the edge of the woods. But by the time I blinked, they were gone. I never took my kids back to a cabin again. had never planned on spending the night in that cabin. It wasn't supposed to be part of the trip. I was in Italy for a short vacation, taking time away from everything back home. Life had been too busy, too overwhelming. I needed quiet. I had rented a car and was driving through the countryside, stopping in small villages, exploring places that weren't crowded with tourists. I wanted to get away from people, from noise, from responsibilities. The region I was driving through had endless rolling hills, thick forests, and winding roads that twisted through the mountains. It was beautiful but also isolated. Most of the time, I didn't see another car for miles. The further I drove, the smaller the roads became. At some point, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. My GPS had no signal and I couldn't read the old road signs. I kept driving, hoping I'd eventually find a main road again. That was when the storm rolled in. The sky darkened fast. Heavy rain started falling, and the road became slick. My headlights barely cut through the mist that had settled over the hills. I tried to drive carefully, but the road was narrow, the turns were sharp, and there were no guardrails. The last thing I wanted was to slide off the edge of a cliff. Then my car sputtered. The engine stuttered, then completely died. I pulled over to the side of the road, but there wasn't much of a shoulder, just a steep drop on one side and thick trees on the other. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. The dashboard lights flickered weakly before going dark. The battery was dead. I sat there for a while, listening to the rain hammer against the windshield, trying to figure out what to do. There was no cell service. No cars had passed me for at least an hour. I didn't know how far I was from the nearest village. I had no choice but to get out and walk. I grabbed my rain jacket, locked the car, and started walking. The road was empty, stretching endlessly through the trees. My shoes sank into the mud, and my clothes were soaked in minutes. The wind howled through the hills, and the rain was relentless. I kept moving forward, hoping I'd find a house or at least a sign of civilization. That was when I saw the cabin. It was an old stone building, set a little ways back from the road, hidden behind thick trees. A narrow dirt path led up to it. It didn't look abandoned. There was a light in one of the windows. Smoke curled from a chimney. Someone was home. I hesitated, but I didn't have many options. I needed shelter. I walked up the path and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I was about to turn away when I noticed the door was slightly open. Just a crack. The wind must have pushed it open. I hesitated, but then I stepped inside. The cabin was small. Just one large room with a fireplace on one side and a small bed in the corner. A wooden table stood in the center, covered in papers. The air smelled of smoke and damp wood. The fire was burning low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Someone lived here, but there was no sign of them. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the space. I didn't want to just stand there dripping water onto the floor, so I stepped inside further, hoping to find a phone or something. Then I noticed the papers on the table. They weren't in Italian. They weren't in any language I recognized. They looked handwritten, scrawled in a rough, uneven script. Some pages had diagrams, maps of the hills outside. Others had lists, names, dates, locations. Something about them unsettled me. I looked around again. There were no personal items. No clothes, no dishes, nothing that suggested someone actually lived here. Just the fire. And then I noticed the smell. Not the wood smoke. Something else, something metallic. Blood. It was faint, but it was there. I turned back toward the door, and that's when I saw him. A man stood in the doorway, blocking my way out. He was tall, soaking wet from the rain. His clothes were dark, heavy. His face was pale, shadowed under the hood of his coat. His eyes dark, sunken, locked onto mine. I froze. I hadn't heard him approach. He didn't move. I took a step back. The fire crackled behind me. The rain pounded against the roof. He didn't say anything, just stood there staring. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. My breath was shallow, my hands clenched into fists. Then he took a step forward. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted for the other side of the cabin, crashing into the table, knocking the papers to the floor. I grabbed the first thing I could, a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. I turned, ready to swing, but he was gone. The door was still open, the rain slashing through the night. I listened, my breath ragged. I could hear nothing over the storm. I had to get out. I moved fast, keeping the iron poker in my hand. I stepped onto the dirt path, glancing around, trying to see if he was still out there. Then I saw the footprints. Fresh, deep footprints in the mud, leading from the trees to the cabin. But not away from it. I ran. I sprinted down the road, slipping in the mud, not looking back. The rain blurred my vision, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Then, in the distance, I saw headlights. Car was coming. I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms. The car slowed, then stopped. An older man rolled down the window, saying something in Italian. I didn't understand, but I didn't care. I just pointed back toward the cabin, shaking my head. He must have understood something was wrong. He motioned for me to get in. I didn't look back until we were miles down the road. I never found out who that man was. The police found my car where I left it, but they never found the cabin. They said there was no cabin out there. Nothing but trees and empty hills. I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't supposed to see it. It wasn't my cabin. I didn't build it. I didn't buy it. But for 6 months, I lived in it. The place belonged to an old friend of my dad's, a guy named Joe. I barely knew him, but my dad vouched for him. He needed someone to look after his property while he worked a job in Texas. I needed a place to stay. It worked out. The cabin was deep in the valley, miles away from the nearest paved road. You had to drive 20 minutes down a dirt path to get to it. I had an old truck, beat up but reliable, and I kept it parked near the porch. The land around the cabin stretched out for miles. Dense trees, rolling hills, and a creek that cut through the back of the property. It was quiet out there, too quiet. The first couple of weeks were fine, peaceful. No traffic, no people, just the sound of birds during the day and crickets at night. I'd sit on the porch in the mornings with a cup of coffee, watching the fog settle over the valley. In the evenings, I'd listen to the wind move through the trees. There was something calming about it. Then little things started happening. I'd wake up to find the front door unlocked when I was sure I locked it. Tools in the shed would be in different places. A chair on the porch moved just a little. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I had left the door unlocked by accident. Maybe I forgot where I put the tools. Maybe the wind moved the chair. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't walk with steady, deliberate steps. I reached for my flashlight and my hunting rifle. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and careful. They stopped at the porch. I held my breath. Then, after what felt like forever, they started moving away. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the dark with my rifle across my lap. By morning, I convinced myself it had to be a deer, a bear maybe, something big enough to sound like footsteps. But I didn't really believe that. A few days later, I found tracks in the dirt near the cabin, boot prints. They led from the trees, circled the cabin, then disappeared back into the woods. I didn't tell anyone. I should have. But part of me didn't want to admit that something was wrong. I started being more careful. I triple-checked the locks every night. I made sure my rifle was loaded. I kept a flashlight and a knife next to my bed. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. I started to relax. Then, one evening, I went down to the creek to fish. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and pink. The air was cool. I sat on a rock, watching the water, waiting for a bite. Then I saw something. Across the creek, on the other side, someone was standing between the trees. Not moving, just standing there. I froze. They were too far away to see clearly. A man, I thought, tall, wearing dark clothes. I stared at him. He stared back. I didn't move. didn't even breathe. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked back into the trees. I grabbed my gear and went straight back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I barely slept that night. Morning came. I thought about leaving, but the truck was low on gas, and the nearest station was over an hour away. I told myself if something else happened, I'd go. Something else happened. That night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the window. It was soft, slow. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. Tap, tap, tap. I reached for my rifle. My hands were shaking. Tap, tap, tap. I forced myself to sit up. I turned on the flashlight and shined it toward the window. Nothing. The tapping stopped. I sat there in the dark, gripping my rifle, listening to the silence outside. Then I heard the front door handle turn. It was locked. Whoever was out there tried again. Then, slowly, they moved around the cabin, testing each window. I held my breath. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I heard footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep after that. Morning came. I checked the property. Footprints. More of them. Someone had been watching the cabin. Getting closer. I was done. I packed my bags, loaded my rifle, and got in my truck. The road out of the valley was long and rough. The whole drive, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road. I never did. I never went back. Joe called me a few weeks later, said he got back to the cabin and found the place in perfect shape. Nothing missing, nothing broken, but he mentioned something strange. He said there were tracks around the property, boot prints, leading from the trees, circling the cabin, then disappearing into the woods. I never told him what happened, and I never looked back. It was early October when I took the job. The man I worked for had a property deep in the woods, an old hunting cabin that needed repairs before the snow came. The pay was fair, and I didn't have much else going on, so I said yes. I packed up my truck with tools, extra clothes, and enough food to last a few weeks. The drive out there took most of the day. At first, it was highways and small towns, then winding back roads through thick trees. Eventually, the pavement ended, and I found myself on a dirt path, bumping over rocks and potholes. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was hanging low in the sky. The place was isolated, surrounded by miles of forest in every direction. The nearest town was over an hour away. The owner had warned me it was remote, but standing there, staring at the dark woods stretching out endlessly, I realized just how alone I was. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. It was a single-story place with a pitched roof and a covered porch. The logs were weathered, the windows streaked with dirt. There was a woodshed off to the side, half full of chopped logs. An outhouse stood a short walk away, tilted slightly from years of frost heaving the ground beneath it. I unlocked the door with the key the owner had mailed me. Inside, the air was stale. Dust coated the wooden floorboards, and the furniture was covered with white sheets. I set my bag down and walked through each room, checking for leaks or damage. The kitchen was small, with an old propane stove and a hand pump for water. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner of the main room, its chimney running up through the roof. The first night was quiet. I cooked some canned soup on the stove, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, and read by lantern light until I got tired. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, making the branches creak. I fell asleep listening to it, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. The next day, I got to work. The porch steps needed replacing, the roof had a few weak spots, and the shed door barely hung on its hinges. I spent the daylight hours hammering, sawing, and hauling wood. It was good, honest work, and by evening, I was too tired to feel uneasy about being alone in the woods. That changed on the third night. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something outside, a crunching sound, footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. My eyes snapped open. I held my breath, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate. I sat up and reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, I didn't move. The only sound was my own breathing. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard a rustling noise, like something moving through the brush. The sound faded into the distance, swallowed by the trees. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. I half expected to see footprints in the dirt, but there was nothing. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer had wandered close in the night. That evening, I made sure to lock the door and prop a chair against it. I kept my flashlight within reach. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. A slow, scraping noise, like nails against wood. I held my breath. The sound moved from one wall to the next, circling the cabin. I sat up, my heart pounding. The scraping stopped near the front door. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the window, but the glass was too dirty to see anything clearly. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I didn't go outside to check. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. When morning came, I forced myself to look around the cabin. This time, I found something. Near the porch steps, a single footprint was pressed into the damp earth. Not a boot print, not an animal track, a bare footprint. Human, but the toes were wrong. They were too long, too thin, and they curved slightly like claws. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was just distorted by the rain. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't true. For the next few days, I barely slept. I kept the fire going, stayed inside after dark, and listened for any sound beyond the walls. The woods felt different now, watchful. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching toward the cabin like fingers. Then, on the fifth night, something happened that made me pack up and leave. Started just after midnight. I heard the footsteps again, moving around the cabin. Slow, patient. Then the doorknob rattled. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. The rattling stopped, replaced by a long, slow scraping sound. Claw-like fingers dragging across the wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the window, and that's when I saw it. A face, pressed against the glass, staring in. The features were almost human but stretched, distorted. The eyes were too big, the mouth too wide. The skin was pale, almost gray, and the thing's breath fogged up the window. I didn't move, couldn't. Then, without warning, it smiled. A slow, deliberate grin that showed too many teeth. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my keys, and didn't bother packing. I ran straight to my truck, yanked open the door, and started the engine. As I backed up, my headlights swept across the trees, and for a brief second, I saw them. Not just one. Several figures standing just beyond the tree line. Watching, I didn't stop. I floored it, speeding down the dirt road, barely keeping control as the truck bounced over potholes. I didn't look back. I reached the main road just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. I drove until I reached town, booked a room in the first motel I found, and locked the door behind me. I never went back to that cabin. The owner called me a week later, asking why I left the job unfinished. I lied, told him I had an emergency and couldn't stay. I didn't tell him about the footprints, or the face in the window. I didn't tell him about the things in the woods, watching, waiting, and I sure as hell didn't tell him about the smile. The border outpost was the kind of place no one wanted to be stationed at for long. A small wooden cabin, set deep in a valley with the closest town nearly 2 hours away. It was just me for the next 6 weeks, alone with the trees, the mountains, and the road that stretched into the wilderness. My job was simple: monitor the border, log any unusual activity, and report to headquarters every morning and evening. The cabin was old but functional. A single-room structure with a cot in one corner, a desk, a shortwave radio, and a wood-burning stove. Supplies came once a week. The road leading here was rough, often washed out during heavy rains. There was a shed behind the cabin where extra fuel, food, and basic tools were stored. The nearest official checkpoint was over 50 miles away, and aside from the occasional patrolling officer passing through, I was alone. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time checking the perimeter, making sure the road was clear, and logging the occasional vehicle that passed by. Most of them were just trucks carrying goods, local hunters, or travelers unaware they were this close to the border. A few looked suspicious, but as long as they didn't linger, I had no reason to intervene. Then, on the fifth night, I noticed something strange. It was nearly midnight when I heard the first noise. Something moving just outside the cabin. Not an animal. I knew the sounds of the forest well enough. This was deliberate, slow, careful. I reached for my rifle and quietly approached the window. The dim porch light barely illuminated the outside, but I caught a glimpse of movement near the tree line. Someone was there. I stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, and scanned the area. Nothing, just the wind stirring the trees. I waited, listening. After a few minutes, I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Maybe it was a poacher or a smuggler testing if the cabin was occupied. Either way, I stayed awake for the rest of the night, waiting. Nothing else happened. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. Fresh ones. They led from the tree line to the shed and then back into the forest. I checked the shed, but nothing was missing. Still, someone had been here watching. The following night, I kept the lights off and waited. Around the same time as before, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, I moved to the window as quietly as possible, staying in the shadows. There was a figure standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible. They were tall, wearing dark clothing. They stood there for nearly a minute, unmoving, before retreating back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. The days passed, and I kept finding small signs that someone had been around. Footprints in the dirt, scratches on the wooden walls of the cabin, a small pile of rocks near the porch that hadn't been there before. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they were watching. One morning, I woke up to find the radio in my cabin dead. It had been working fine the night before, and I had checked the connections. It wasn't just static, it was completely silent. I tried the backup in the shed. Same thing, no signal. The nearest town was too far for my handheld to reach. I was cut off. That night, I stayed up, rifle in hand. If they were going to come closer, I was going to be ready. The cabin was completely dark, and I sat near the window, watching the tree line. Around 2 in the morning, I saw movement. Not just one figure, two. They moved quickly, low to the ground, making their way toward the shed. My heart pounded as I raised my rifle, but I didn't move. I wanted to see what they were doing. One of them tried the door, locked. The other circled around the side, disappearing from view. Seconds later, I heard the sound of wood splintering. They were trying to break in. I stepped onto the porch, aiming in their direction. "I'm armed," I called out. Silence. Then the sound of footsteps retreating. They disappeared into the trees before I could get a good look at them. I waited, my pulse racing, but they didn't return. By morning, the shed door was damaged but still holding. I checked inside, nothing was missing. I spent the day securing everything, reinforcing the doors and windows. I didn't know what they wanted, but they weren't stopping. That night, I heard something new, a whisper, faint, coming from just outside the cabin. My name. My stomach turned to ice. I gripped the rifle and stayed in the darkness. Whoever it was, they knew who I was. I barely breathed as I listened. The whisper came again, this time from the back of the cabin. Then a soft tapping on the wall. I didn't move. I didn't respond. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then silence. Minutes passed. An hour. Nothing. When the sun rose, I checked outside. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. For the next 3 days, I barely slept. The whispering didn't return, but I kept seeing figures in the trees. Always watching, never approaching. I was running low on supplies, and the next scheduled drop-off was still 4 days away. The radio was still dead. Then, on the 9th night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of my door creaking open. I had locked it. I was sure of it. My heart slammed in my chest as I reached for my rifle. The cabin was pitch black. I stayed perfectly still, listening. A footstep. Inside. I didn't think. I fired a shot toward the sound. The muzzle flash lit up the room for a split second. There was no one there. I scrambled for my flashlight, shining it around. The door was open, swaying slightly. Outside, in the darkness, I saw them, at least 4 figures standing just beyond the porch, watching. I slammed the door shut, barricading it with the desk. My hands were shaking. They weren't just watching anymore. They were coming inside. I stayed awake until dawn, gun in hand. The figures didn't return, but I knew they were still out there. By noon, I packed my bag, grabbed every weapon I had, and left. I didn't care about protocol. I didn't care about the job. I walked down that broken road until I saw the supply truck in the distance. I waved them down. The driver took one look at me and didn't ask any questions. He just let me in and drove. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked what happened to the next guy who took my place. And I never, ever want to be that alone again. I never wanted the cabin. It was my uncle's before it became mine. He was one of those men who lived in the woods half the time, alone, doing whatever old men do when they don't want to be around people. He wasn't exactly a hermit, but close. He had a job in town, worked for a logging company, but every weekend he'd drive up to that cabin, and some weekends he wouldn't come back. I only went there once as a kid. My dad brought me up one summer when I was 10. It wasn't a fun trip. No TV, no neighbors, just trees and silence. The cabin smelled like old wood, damp clothes, and something sour in the corners. I remember asking my dad why Uncle Martin lived there. "Some people like to be alone," was all he said. Years later, Uncle Martin died. He fell off a ladder while clearing some tree branches behind the cabin. I wasn't close to him, so it didn't hit me hard, but the will was a surprise. He left the cabin to me. I didn't want it. I worked a construction job, lived in a small apartment, and had no interest in a rotting wooden house in the middle of nowhere. Selling it seemed like the best option, but I couldn't afford to leave work for long, and the place needed repairs before anyone would buy it. I decided to take a weekend and drive up there, fix a few things, clean up, and make a plan to get rid of it. Just 2 days, I told myself. I packed my truck with basic tools, some food, and a sleeping bag, figuring the old bed would be useless. The drive was long. The deeper I went into the woods, the worse the roads got. By the time I turned onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, the sun was already sinking. The trees stretched high on both sides, swallowing the road in shadow. The cabin looked the same as I remembered. Small, dark wood, set back from the road. The front porch sagged a little, and the windows were covered in grime. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. It was dead silent. No cars, no voices, just wind in the trees and the ticking of my cooling engine. I grabbed my bag, went up the steps, and unlocked the door. Inside, it smelled just like I remembered. Dust and damp wood. The place was a mess. Old clothes, empty cans, a thick layer of dust on everything. I left my bag on the table and opened a few windows to air it out. I planned to sleep early, but I wanted to check the back of the cabin first, where Uncle Martin had his accident. The yard was overgrown, the trees pressing in close. The ladder was still there, tipped over in the grass. The broken branch was easy to spot, hanging like a snapped bone from the trunk. I stared at it for a while. The ground beneath was hard-packed dirt. No rocks, nothing sharp. A bad fall could kill a man, sure, but something about it felt off. I shook it off and went back inside. I ate a sandwich, checked my phone, no signal, and rolled out my sleeping bag on the couch. The air was cold, but I was too tired to care. The silence pressed in as I lay there. No traffic, no voices, just trees shifting in the wind. Then I heard something outside, a rustling, not the wind, something moving through the brush. I sat up, listening hard. It was slow, steady, something big, a deer maybe, or a bear. I reached for my flashlight and stood up, moving to the window. I couldn't see much, just the dark shapes of trees. Then it stopped. Dead silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, my hand tight on the flashlight. Then, just as I was about to turn away, something moved near the tree line. A shape too tall for an animal. It was standing there, just beyond the reach of the light. I could feel it watching me. I stepped back from the window, my pulse hammering. Maybe it was a trick of the light, my tired brain playing games with me. I shut the window, locked the door, and grabbed my hunting knife from my bag. The sound didn't come back. I sat on the couch, knife in my lap, and waited. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I don't remember falling asleep. When I woke up, the sun was creeping through the windows. Everything seemed normal. No footprints, no broken windows. Maybe it was just an animal. I spent the day working, cleaning, fixing loose boards, clearing out junk. I wanted to finish fast, but the hours dragged. By evening, I was exhausted. Then I saw them. Footprints. In the dirt behind the cabin, near the ladder. Not boot prints, bare feet. They came from the woods, stopped near the ladder, then turned back. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. I checked my truck. Still locked. Nothing was missing. I wanted to leave, but it was getting dark, and driving those roads at night wasn't safe. I locked the doors, made sure my knife was close, and sat in the dark, waiting. The noise came back, not rustling. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My breath locked in my throat. I gripped the knife, my palms slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. A shadow passed by the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly dropped the knife. I forced myself to stay still. The knob turned again. Slow, testing, then silence. Long, awful silence. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and yanked open the door. The footprints were still there, leading from the woods, and back into them. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I hit town. I put the cabin up for sale the same week. I never went back. Whoever was out there, whoever stood at my door in the dark, they could have it. I just hoped they didn't follow me home. It was late October, a cold, wet time of year in this part of France. I had taken some time off work and rented a cabin deep in the countryside, a few miles outside a small village near the Massif Central. It wasn't a touristy area, which is what I liked about it. The cabin sat alone on a patch of land surrounded by dense forests. A narrow gravel road, more of a track, led up to it, winding through the trees before ending at a small clearing. The only neighbor was an old, abandoned house about a half-mile away, barely visible through the thick branches. I wanted solitude. I told myself I needed it. Life had been relentless, and I craved the stillness of nature, the quiet hum of the forest, the simple routine of chopping wood, cooking basic meals, and sitting by the fire with a book. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no television, just a radio with a weak signal which I barely used. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time exploring the woods, taking long walks through damp trails covered in fallen leaves. I found an old hunting tower, long abandoned, its wooden beams covered in moss. I sat up there for a while, staring at the landscape, feeling small beneath the vast sky. At night, I cooked over the small stove and read by the dim light of a lantern. The wind howled against the cabin, and the rain came down in sheets, but inside, with the fire crackling, it felt safe. Then, on the third day, I noticed something strange. It was late afternoon, and I had been chopping wood behind the cabin when I felt it. That unmistakable feeling of being watched. I stopped, axe frozen in mid-swing, and looked up. The forest stood still, shadows stretching between the trees. Nothing moved, no branches rustled. The silence felt different, heavier. I told myself it was my imagination, just my mind playing tricks on me after spending too much time alone. But the feeling stayed with me. It followed me as I stacked the wood, as I went inside, as I made dinner. Even as I read by the fire that night, I found myself glancing at the window, expecting to see something move in the darkness. The next morning, I went for a walk, hoping fresh air would clear my head. The rain had let up, leaving the forest damp and misty. I followed a narrow path leading away from the cabin, deeper into the trees. After about a mile, I came across something I hadn't seen before. A small clearing with an old stone building, half collapsed. It looked like it had once been a barn or maybe a hunting lodge. The roof had caved in on one side, and vines crept over the walls. Something about it unsettled me. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints, no disturbances in the dirt, but I had the overwhelming sense that someone had been there. I turned to leave when I noticed something on the ground. A cigarette, but half buried in the wet soil. Fresh. Someone had been here recently. I walked back to the cabin, moving faster than I had on the way in. The sense of unease grew stronger with each step. By the time I reached my clearing, I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if I had led something back with me. That night, I barely slept. The wind rattled the windows, and the trees groaned in the distance. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke suddenly to a sound outside. Footsteps. I froze, listening. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the wet grass. Then silence. I lay there, heart pounding, every muscle tense. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer maybe, but deep down I knew better. I waited, barely breathing. The only sound was the wind against the cabin. Then, just as I started to convince myself I had imagined it, I heard it again, closer this time. Someone was outside. I slipped out of bed, moving carefully so the wooden floor wouldn't creak. I reached for the axe I kept near the door. The cabin was small, just one main room with a little kitchen in the corner, and from where I stood, I could see both windows. I moved to the one facing the front, slowly pulling back the curtain. Nothing, just darkness. I checked the other window, and that's when I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching the cabin. I gripped the axe tighter, my pulse hammering. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, but I couldn't make out his face. He didn't carry a flashlight. He didn't call out. He just stood there. I don't know how long I watched him. Maybe a few seconds, maybe minutes, but finally he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair near the door, axe in hand, listening. The footsteps never returned, but the forest felt different, heavier, like it was holding its breath. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I had enough supplies to last, but I wasn't going to spend another night out here. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my backpack, not caring if it was organized. But when I stepped outside, I stopped cold. Footprints, deep, clear imprints in the wet grass, leading from the woods to the window where I had stood last night. He had been closer than I thought. I locked up the cabin, though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined to get inside. I hiked back to my car, moving fast, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't see him again, but I felt him watching. When I reached the village, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was a hunter, someone passing through. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had stayed one more night, things would have ended differently. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who he was. I had never been one for isolation, but life had a way of pushing people into situations they never expected. The cabin belonged to my uncle, a man I hadn't spoken to in years, not since I was a teenager. He passed away a few months ago, and with no other direct family left, the property fell to me. It was deep in a valley, far from the nearest town, surrounded by thick forests and hills that swallowed any sound. A river ran somewhere nearby, though I couldn't see it from the porch. The place had been abandoned for years. When I arrived, it was clear no one had set foot here in a long time. The door had warped from weather, the roof sagged slightly in places, and dust coated everything inside. I had come to get the place ready to sell. That was the plan. Stay for a week, clean up, take some pictures, find a buyer, and be done with it. I figured a place like this would attract some hunter or retiree looking for peace and quiet. The first few days were uneventful. I worked during the day, clearing out old furniture, sweeping the floors, fixing up whatever I could. At night, I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was a different kind of quiet out here, the kind that made you feel like you weren't alone. The wind through the trees almost sounded like whispers. The rustling in the brush just outside the porch light's reach always had me glancing up, expecting to see something standing there. There was nothing, of course, just the usual night creatures, raccoons, maybe a deer, but it unsettled me. On the fourth day, I decided to check out the shed behind the cabin. It was about 50 yards into the woods, half buried in brush and dead leaves. The padlock was rusted shut, but the wood around the latch was weak, so I pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old wood. Tools hung on the walls, covered in cobwebs. A workbench sat against the back wall, cluttered with rusted nails, screws, and cans of paint that had long since dried up. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. A sleeping bag, crumpled up in the corner. Empty food cans stacked neatly beside it. A pair of boots, worn and caked with dried mud. Someone had been living here. Recently, I backed out of the shed, scanning the trees. The thought of someone watching me, maybe right now, sent a cold wave through my chest. I locked the shed back up as best as I could and walked back to the cabin, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. I kept my gun on the nightstand, something I hadn't felt the need to do before. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind against the walls, had me wide awake, listening, waiting. Sometime after midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal, not the quick, darting sounds of a raccoon or the heavy steps of a deer. This was slow, deliberate, footsteps on the porch. My stomach tightened. I reached for the gun, my fingers stiff with adrenaline. The floorboards creaked. Someone was out there. I stayed still, barely breathing. Through the thin curtains, I saw a shadow shift across the porch. Someone was standing there, just outside the front door. I waited, listened. The footsteps moved again, this time towards the window. A shape passed by, just enough for me to see that it was a person. No flashlight, no talking, just standing there in the dark. Then, nothing. I don't know how long I lay there, gripping the gun. My heart beat so loud in my ears that I couldn't hear anything else. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Eventually, I forced myself to sit up, to move to the window. No one was there. The next morning, I searched the area, looking for tracks. The ground was too hard, too covered in dead leaves to see anything clear, but I knew what I had heard. Someone had been here. I packed my things. I wasn't going to spend another night in that cabin. I was loading my truck when I noticed something on the porch. The old welcome mat had been moved, pushed aside. Underneath, carved into the wood, were letters. "Don't stay." It wasn't fresh. The carving had been there for a while, but I hadn't noticed it before. How long had my uncle known? Had he been dealing with the same thing before he died? I didn't wait to find out. I got in the truck and drove, not stopping until I reached town. I booked a motel room for the night, barely slept, and by morning, I had called a realtor. I didn't care about fixing the place up anymore. I never went back. Months later, after the sale had gone through, I looked up old records on the property. My uncle had bought the land from a family in the early 90s. Before that, it had belonged to another man, a hermit who had disappeared sometime in the 70s. No one knew what happened to him. The new owner never reached out. I never asked. Whatever was out there, it wasn't my problem anymore. But I still wonder. When the wind is just right, when the night is too quiet, I remember the sound of those footsteps on the porch. And I wonder if the new owner has heard them too. I never planned on staying in the old cabin. It was supposed to be a quick stop, just long enough to check on the property and make sure everything was in order before I headed back to the city. My uncle had left it to me when he passed, an old wooden place sitting at the edge of a graveyard in a small town nobody really cared about. I hadn't been there in years. The cabin had been in my family for decades, but it had never really been a home. My uncle used it as a retreat, a place to get away from people. The graveyard behind it was old, mostly forgotten. There were headstones that leaned, names that had faded away with time. Some graves looked like they hadn't been visited in decades, maybe longer. I never understood why anyone would want to live so close to a place like that. But my uncle never seemed to mind. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The air smelled damp, like rain had passed through earlier. The trees around the cabin were tall, their branches twisted together like they were trying to block out the sky. The place looked exactly how I remembered it. Dark wood, a sagging porch, windows that seemed too small. The graveyard stretched out behind it, headstones barely visible through the trees. The door was stiff when I pushed it open, and the air inside smelled like dust and would rot. The furniture was still in place, a heavy wooden table, an old armchair in the corner, shelves filled with books that hadn't been touched in years. I set my bag down near the door and walked through the place, checking for leaks or any damage. The cabin was solid, but it felt abandoned in a way that made my skin itch. I had planned to leave before it got dark. The idea of staying overnight had never crossed my mind. But by the time I finished looking through everything, the sun was already low, and my truck wouldn't start. I checked the battery, the fuel, everything I could think of. Nothing. My phone had no signal, which didn't surprise me. I tried walking down the road a bit, hoping to find a spot with better reception, but it was useless. I had no choice but to stay the night. I found some candles in the kitchen drawer and lit a few, setting them around the room. The cabin had electricity, but I didn't trust the wiring enough to turn on the lights. The old floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved around, the sound stretching out into the silence. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees swayed, their branches scraping against the roof. The graveyard was nothing more than a dark mass beyond the window, the headstones barely visible in the fading light. I tried to sleep. The armchair was stiff, the cushion worn thin. I shifted, trying to get comfortable, but my body wouldn't relax. I kept listening, waiting for something. I didn't know what. The wind? A branch falling? The sound of an animal moving through the grass? Then I heard it. A crunch. Not the wind. Not a branch. Footsteps. I sat up, my breath slow and careful. The sound had come from outside, near the graveyard. I told myself it was nothing. An animal. The wind shifting something in the yard. But then it came again. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the dead leaves. I reached for my bag, my fingers wrapping around the handle of the knife I always carried when I traveled. The footsteps stopped. I stayed still, my hand tight around the knife, my ears straining. Nothing moved. The wind rattled the branches, but the footsteps were gone. I didn't sleep. By morning, the world looked normal again. The graveyard was just a graveyard. The trees were just trees. The night had played tricks on me, that was all. I tried the truck again. Still nothing. I needed to find help. The town was about 3 miles down the road. Not a bad walk, but not one I wanted to make. The road was narrow, lined with trees that made it feel more like a tunnel. As I walked, I kept looking back at the cabin, at the graveyard stretching out behind it. The feeling didn't leave me, even in the daylight. I made it to town, found a mechanic, and brought him back to look at the truck. He checked everything, tried a few things, and then gave me a look I didn't like. "Nothing's wrong with it," he said. I stared at him. "It won't start." He shrugged. "I don't know what to tell you. Battery's fine. Fuel's good. Should be running." But it wasn't. He offered to tow it back to town, but I wasn't ready to leave yet. I told him I'd figure it out, and he left, shaking his head like he thought I was making a mistake. Back at the cabin, the air felt heavier. I stepped onto the porch and looked toward the graveyard. Something was off. A grave had been disturbed. The dirt was loose, uneven, like it had been dug up and put back in a hurry. The headstone was old, the name unreadable. I didn't want to look, but I forced myself to walk closer. The ground had been moved, not by an animal, not by the weather, by hands. I felt sick. My mind tried to make sense of it, tried to come up with a reason that didn't make my skin crawl. Maybe someone had been digging for something. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't convince myself. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in the chair, the knife in my hand, my ears straining for the sound of footsteps. They came around midnight. Slow, closer. I gripped the knife tighter. The door rattled. Not the wind, not an animal. Something was outside. I didn't breathe. The handle turned, slow testing. I bolted, grabbed my bag, shoved the door open, and ran. The truck started on the first try. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached town, until I was surrounded by buildings and people and the comfort of streetlights. I sold the cabin the next week. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted it gone. I never found out what happened that night. Never went back. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear it. The sound of footsteps in the dark. I never thought much about what I would do in a life or death situation. People like to imagine themselves as heroes, the ones who fight back, who make the right choices. But the truth is, when you're in it, when the danger is real, you don't know what you'll do until it happens. I learned that the hard way one winter in the middle of nowhere. It started as a simple getaway. I was between jobs, burned out from city life, and needed some space to clear my head. A buddy of mine had a small hunting cabin tucked away in the mountains. He told me I could use it for a while. Said it was nothing fancy. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a cot, and a stack of firewood to last the season. It was exactly what I needed, or at least that's what I thought. The drive up took longer than expected. The roads were narrow, winding, covered in patches of ice. It was late December, and a storm had just passed through, leaving everything blanketed in white. The trees on either side of the road were heavy with snow, their branches bending under the weight. It was beautiful, but there was something eerie about it, too. Something too quiet, too still. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. The place was just as my friend had described, small, weathered, barely more than a shack. But it had a roof, for walls, and enough wood to keep me warm through the night. That was all I needed. I parked my truck near the tree line, close enough to grab my things, but far enough that it wouldn't get buried in case another storm rolled in. The air was crisp, biting at my skin as I hauled my gear inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a single room with a cot against the back wall, a small table, and a wood stove in the corner. A lantern sat on the table, its glass covered in dust. There were no windows, just the door and a small vent near the roof for smoke to escape. It was basic, but it would do. I spent the first hour unpacking, stacking firewood near the stove, setting up my sleeping bag on the cot. The quiet settled in thick around me, the kind that pressed down on you, made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. That night, the wind howled through the trees, rattling against the cabin walls. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the crackling of the fire, the occasional groan of the wood as the cabin shifted with the cold. I told myself it was peaceful. I told myself this was what I came here for. But then I heard it, a sound outside. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, a slow, deliberate crunch of snow underfoot. I sat up, heart hammering. I waited, listening. The wind gusted, rattling the roof, but beneath it, I could hear something else, movement. Not an animal, not the wind, footsteps. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the door. Nothing, just the old wooden planks, the iron latch holding it shut. The sound had stopped. I told myself it was my imagination, that the wind had shifted the snow, made it sound like something was moving. I forced myself to lie back down, to close my eyes. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, I stepped outside to find footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. I stood there for a long moment, staring at them. They came from the woods, circled the cabin, then stopped at the door. I checked my truck. Nothing was missing. The footprints didn't lead away, just stopped at the cabin, then vanished. Like whoever made them had stood there, waiting, watching. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe some hiker had gotten lost, passed by in the night, and moved on. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. There were no tracks leading away, no sign that anyone had left. Just those prints in the snow, like someone had come right up to my door and disappeared. I spent the day chopping more wood, checking my gear, keeping myself busy. But the feeling stayed with me, that crawling unease in the back of my mind. That night, I locked the door, checked it twice, then lay in my sleeping bag with my flashlight in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. I didn't sleep. The third night was worse. I woke up to the sound of something moving inside the cabin. Took me a second to realize what was wrong. The fire had burned low, barely casting any light. My lantern was off, but I could hear it breathing. Someone was inside with me. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. I just listened. Slow, shallow breaths. Close. I tightened my grip on the knife, forcing myself to stay still. My heart pounded so hard I was sure whoever was in the cabin could hear it. Then the breathing stopped. A long silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. I flicked on my flashlight. The cabin was empty. I scrambled up, heart hammering, sweeping the light over every inch of the room. The door was still locked from the inside. No windows, no way in. But I wasn't alone. The cot creaked as I shifted my weight, and that's when I saw it. The floor near the door. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the door to my cot. Stopped right beside me. Someone had been standing over me while I slept. I grabbed my gear and bolted. I didn't think. Didn't look back. I just ran for my truck, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking so bad I almost dropped them. The engine roared to life, tires spinning in the snow as I tore down the road, not stopping, not slowing, not caring if I hit ice and slid off the mountain. I drove through the night, didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a gas station with flickering lights and a clerk who looked half asleep. I must have looked like a madman, stumbling inside, breathless, eyes wild. I told them someone had been in my cabin, that I wasn't alone up there. They called the sheriff. He drove up the next morning, checked the place out. He found the footprints, found the door still locked from the inside, but no sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone else. Just my things, left behind in my rush to escape. And one more thing, a single handprint on the inside of the door, too high up to be mine, like someone had been standing there, pressing their palm against the wood, listening to me, waiting. The sheriff told me there were no other cabins nearby. No one reported missing. Just me alone in that cabin. Except I wasn't alone. I never went back. I don't know who or what was in there with me, but I know this. I locked that door, and somehow they still got in. I was stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado when I first heard about the hunting cabin in the San Isabel National Forest. It was one of those places passed down through whispered conversations in the barracks. An old, isolated structure deep in the woods, supposedly owned by a retired Army officer. Some of the guys used it as a retreat when they wanted to get away from the regimented life on base. I had been in the Army for almost a decade, serving as a sergeant in an infantry unit. It wasn't an easy job, but it was the only life I knew. The discipline, the structure, the unspoken brotherhood, it all made sense to me. But lately, I had been feeling burned out. The constant cycle of deployments, training, and dealing with the younger recruits was wearing me down. I needed a break. That's how I ended up in that cabin. I had borrowed the key from one of the guys, a corporal named Evans, who told me the place hadn't been used in months. Perfect for some peace and quiet, he had said. I packed light, just some food, extra clothes, my knife, and my sidearm, a standard issue Beretta M9. I didn't expect any trouble, but years in the military had taught me to always be prepared. The drive took a few hours, and by the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was already dipping behind the tree line. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, barely more than a path carved through the dense forest. The trees pressed in from both sides, their branches stretching overhead like skeletal fingers. I kept my eyes on the road, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. When I finally reached the cabin, I could tell it had seen better days. It was a simple, one-room structure with a pitched roof and a small porch. The wood was weathered and gray, and the windows were coated in a thin layer of dust. A rusted metal chimney stuck out of the roof at an angle. I stepped out of the truck and stretched, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. No wind, no distant hum of insects, nothing. Just the soft crunch of gravel under my boots as I approached the door. The lock clicked open easily, and I stepped inside. The air smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. A single cot sat in one corner, its thin mattress covered in a layer of dust. A wooden table with a couple of chairs was pushed against the far wall. There was an old cast-iron stove, a pile of firewood stacked beside it. Someone had left a few cans of food on a shelf, but they were years past their expiration date. I dropped my bag on the cot and did a quick sweep of the place. The windows were intact, and the door was solid. Satisfied, I grabbed my rifle and stepped back outside to gather some firewood. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, almost erased by the wind, but they were there, leading from the tree line to the cabin. My first thought was that they belonged to Evans or someone else who had used the cabin recently. But as I looked closer, I realized something was off. The prints were deep, heavier than they should have been, and they weren't made by standard issue boots. Something about them put me on edge. I scanned the tree line, my pulse quickening. The forest was thick, the shadows deepening as the last of the sunlight faded. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a hunter passing through. But the unease stayed with me as I carried the firewood inside. That night I couldn't sleep. The silence pressed in on me, the darkness stretching endlessly beyond the thin walls of the cabin. I kept my Beretta close, listening to every creak, every shift of the wind. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. I woke to the sound of something moving outside. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but my instincts flared to life. I reached for my gun, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise came again, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel. I slid out of the cot, moving silently toward the window. The moon had risen, casting a pale glow over the clearing. First, I saw nothing, just the trees, the road, the empty porch. But then, near the edge of the woods, I saw it, just a shadow, a shape that didn't belong. Someone was out there. I stayed still, barely breathing, watching. The figure moved, shifting slightly, then disappeared into the trees. I waited, my grip tightening on the gun, but the footsteps faded. Whoever it was, they were gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the dark, back against the wall, eyes on the door. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sun was up, I went outside. The footprints were back. This time, they led from the porch back into the woods. Whoever had been watching me had been close. Too close. I knew I had two choices: pack up and leave or find out who was out there. I chose the second. Years in the army had conditioned me to push forward, to face threats head-on. I wasn't about to let some backwoods creep intimidate me. I grabbed my rifle, checked my gear, and started tracking. The footprints led deeper into the forest, winding between the trees. The ground was uneven, covered in damp leaves and exposed roots. I moved carefully, scanning my surroundings, my senses sharp. After about half a mile, I found it. A second cabin. It was smaller than mine, barely more than a shack, half hidden behind a thicket of pines. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. I approached slowly, gun raised. The air smelled wrong, like rot and old blood. Inside, the place was a mess. A single cot was shoved against the wall, the mattress stained dark. Empty food cans littered the floor, and in the center of the room, a pile of clothing. Military clothing, I stepped closer, my stomach twisting. The patches had been cut off, but I recognized the fabric, the stitching. These had belonged to a soldier. Then I saw the blood. It was dried, smeared across the floor and walls. And in the corner, half buried under a tarp, a body. The face was unrecognizable, but the dog tags were still around the neck. Evans. A noise behind me. I spun, but it was too late. A blur of movement, the glint of a blade. Pain exploded in my side, hot and sharp. I hit the ground hard, my vision swimming. The man above me was wild-eyed, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He was wearing an army jacket, but it wasn't his. I fought, adrenaline surging, my hands scrabbling for my gun. The second shot was enough. The man staggered, his knife clattering to the floor. I pushed him off, gasping for breath, my side burning. I didn't look at him as I stumbled out of the cabin, my hands slick with blood. By the time I reached my truck, the world was spinning. I barely made it onto the road before the pain swallowed me whole. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital. The police found the body in the cabin. Evans had been missing for weeks, but no one had thought to look out here. His killer was an ex-soldier, dishonorably discharged, living off the grid. He had stolen uniforms, hunting down former comrades. I never went back to that cabin. Somewhere in those woods, the memories still linger. The footprints, the silence, the cold weight of a knife against my ribs, and the knowledge that I had been just one step away from ending up like Evans.